When I first found out we were going to get under the canopy, I was so excited because I'm a sociologist, that's my degree, and I was super excited to find out. I wanted to explore the cultural aspect of how. So, you know, if you visit under the canopy, you've seen how it really speaks to preserving the ecology of the rainforest for the animals, but it doesn't really talk about the people. And I think there are people being impacted by the deforestation. And so I sought out a person in this area who could speak to that. And somehow I strong-armed Anthony speaking for us today. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. He's Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at University. First of all, you have to know, he started out, his undergraduate is in
music.
And I think it's lovely that he does. Anyway, that's a whole other side. But for his doctoral dissertation, he lived for several years with his wife and their baby girl with a group of Indigenous people while he studied their ecology. In his 27 years at ISU, he was gone for 13 of those years while continuing his studies and providing technical support for Indigenous land claims in South and Central American continent. He has continued to do that 17 years on his retirement at ISU, and he has collaborated with a number of environmental groups interested in studying for it. But these folks know little or nothing about the Indigenous people who live there, and so he's been their voice in that sense. And so they don't know how to protect their own ecology. But the point of view he brings to the table is that if you let the Indigenous people run their own land, their own practices will protect the animals. So, Dr. Anthony.
Yeah, I always say if we want to save the rainforest, we have to give it to the Indians. It's their habitat. They live there. It's the forest, as you will note in this presentation, is pretty important. Kim has this. I sent her this this thing from the New York Times that was. It's called "Kicking Native People Off Their Land is a Horrible Way to Save the Planet." And that is because, and as this author makes out, Robert Williams, the Indigenous people are the ones that know that environment, and they have practices, as you will find from this presentation, that make it worthwhile. So I'll start by talking about Africa a little bit. Have you ever wondered why there are no elephants and camels and all the camelids in the United States or in North America? The usual explanation is that the Pleistocene, they all got frozen out, and some people argue that the Indians might have killed some of them. All these people that came into the out of Asia back 35,000 years ago on the average. But then that makes you wonder, why the hell didn't they die in Africa? They suffered the same thing. And the reason is, I think, because the Africans evolved with those animals, and they learned how to take care of them, and they learned how to hunt what they needed, and they learned how not to hunt. And so all these years later, we still have elephants and rhinoceroses and hippopotamuses and all these animals in Africa. We don't have any of that here. And I think the Indigenous people had quite a bit to do with it. About 35,000 years ago, they came across the Bering Strait, some of them, and they probably started killing animals because they didn't evolve with them. They came from Asia, right? And they had no idea about saving anything. And it took them about somewhere around 20,000 years to 10,000 years to get into the jungles of South America. 6,000 years ago, some of them made their way into Central America. Okay. Whoa. So about 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, they made their way as far as Brazil. and they found these environments. This is the Amazon River. It was actually fairly well populated. Our estimates is that as many as 4 million people lived in Brazil along the Amazon. They didn't live upstream. The other indigenous people had their own way of doing things, and of course, when the Spanish and Portuguese invaded, 95% of them died. Most of them died without ever seeing a European. The forest looks like this in some places. Some places it looks like this. Some of it is really hilly. I spent a couple of years living in the high Amazon basin in Peru. There's a person in this picture, and it is me. I'm reading The Art of the Shaman, Michael Harner's book on shamanism in South America, as I wander through the forest. So 10,000, some of these folks, like there are 7 of what we call haplotypes of indigenous people in all of the Americas. And one of them is the Aleut haplotype. And you don't find any Aleuts anywhere in Central or South America until you get to the Chilean islands. And they apparently came down around 15,000 years ago by boat, and never did interact with the other indigenous people there. This is some of the folks that hang out in the Amazon and are protected by a number of different tribes. This is the resplendent quetzal. It's illegal in Guatemala. It's a national bird of Guatemala, and it's illegal to kill one. And about 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Maya came down from Mesoamerica, where they had settled in Mexico, and they made cities. And this is one of the sites of Tikal in Guatemala. If you're ever there, you should definitely go try to Tikal. These are the things that affect indigenous people harmfully. And one of the big things the worst things for them is cattle, because to raise cattle, you have to clear the forest and you have to make space. And that means that you're taking land away from some indigenous people that live there. And that is harmful. And here's another big thing that manages to use up Indian lands is loggers. They will bribe people to let them into their lands and promise them that they're going to bring them schools, and they'll build a road, and then they take their wood and they're gone. So one of the things that indigenous people have learned in the years of 10,000 years or so they've been living there under the canopy is population control. And population control and genetic diversity control. This is the Cocamilla village plaza. It was founded by Jesuit priests who always liked to have a plaza and a church on the plaza. And the Cocamilla are Tupian speakers, and their first priest was amazed that they killed most of their own babies. And where did they get their population control? They went headhunting every year down the Amazon and took children who were 7 or 8 years old and brought them back. They'd kill their parents and bring the babies back, and that, I think, provided a lot of genetic diversity for them. It also eliminated those first few years that babies die. I've lived with several people who actually lose 50% of their children, and the Cocamilla probably had the same problem. This is high water, which right now is disastrously high because of mestizos cutting forest in the upper Cocamilla area. And this is low water. Water goes down about 30 feet. or it comes up about 30 feet, and that's my boat. That was my boat out there. To go live with the Cocamilla, they insisted that I have a boat so I could help them market bananas. This is Calle Progreso. You can see how that's pretty progressive. And these are Cocamilla women. It's at the festival of Todos Santos, which is All Saints Day. And they are making mayos, which they only make for ritual purposes. And they are made out of manioc, and you'll see some manioc in a bit. These are Cocamilla men, and they're hauling a canoe because it gets felled in the forest, the log for it, and it gets hollowed out as much as it can, and then it ends up on the shore of the lake where people gather it, they finish construction of the canoe. This is, yeah, that's a picture of my daughter and my compadre and comadre, Olga. She was 4 months old when we took her to the Amazon, and she was about 3 when we came back. And then when she was about 5, I took her back for a summer. And so she'd learned to paddle a canoe. Not surprisingly, the girl is an anthropologist today. The Kandawashi people here, I lived with them for about 8 months, and they're headhunters. And they are one of the world's people who believe that if you take a picture of them, they'll lose their soul, their spirit. And so they insisted they want me to take pictures of these women because they're making string. And you can see that they use their toes as well as their feet. They're pretty handy with both of them. They can grasp things and, pick up things with their toes. They have these women have all the power in the community. The community is matrilocal and matrilineal, which means that the women, the husbands come from other villages and they live in this village with these women. And if you mess with one of these women, they'll kick you out of the village and you can just go home. And if you're married if you frequently have a case where two brothers marry women, and if one of them gets kicked out for abuse, the other one has to leave too. They lose about 50% of their children. I did learn to shrink a head with them, though. That was one thing. I used to teach my students how to do that, and then I thought that was kind of tacky. What do you think? Yeah, the Cocamilla, by the way, rule out marriage and children for anyone with club feet. Somehow they managed. They were dominated by mestizos for a while, and somehow club feet got into their genetic program. But if you have club feet, you can't get married and can't have children. And these Kandoshi women back here, if you for you to have a wife and kids, you're a man, you have to make a headdress. And the headdress involves some brilliant blue feathers around the top of the crown. And the only way you can get them is to use your blowgun, and you have to be able to shoot 80 feet in the air and kill a tiny bird. And you have to do that half a dozen times to get enough feathers to make your headdress. If you can't do that, which means you're probably your eyes are complicated, that you can't marry, can't have kids. So there's some genetic control here. The Tapita Pay rules for population. My advisor for my doctorate was Charles Wagley, a noted anthropologist, and he worked with Tupians back in the 1940s, and he learned their rules for children, which is that the first child had to be a male, the second child had to be a female, and the third child could be either, but child mortality meant the population growth rate was 0. And that was from people who had never seen very many whites before. So I think that was probably pretty normal for a lot of groups is to just concentrate on not having a huge population. That what? You'd kill it. You would kill the first one. Yeah. And the second one had to be female, and the third one could be either. But yeah, zero population growth. And that's one of the few studies that we know of people who were almost never contacted before in Brazil. You what? What?
What country are these photos from?
Oh, these are from Peru. These are from Peru. I went to the Condoche because the Catholic Church, Peru had a program for giving people land, and the Catholic fathers wanted me to take my boat and my wife and baby up and live with these people. They had some nuns living with them, but I went up there and counted them and got to understand how they farmed and how they hunted. And then I left after 8 months, came back to the US and looked for a job. This is a Mosquito village in Nicaragua. And the Mosquito people have ways of preserving the forests that are pretty interesting. One of the things that all the indigenous people have to do in order to live with the forest is to make sure you don't get big holes in it, right? You want to maintain the forest as a forest to the degree that is possible. These are Mosquito men and women and children at a place called Walaquitan. And here's a Mosquito man with a perfectly good Mosquito name. His name is John Henry Lewis. The Mosquito, as you might know, in Nicaragua were conquered by the British. They lived on the coast of Nicaragua and into Honduras, and the British, the Mosquito language, whatever it was at that time, became a pidgin, and then it gradually grew up to be a language again. But it has no irregular verbs, so it's one of the easier languages that I've ever had to learn. John Henry just burned his motor up. That's why he's got that shit-eating grin on his face. All Mosquito don't look like John Henry. This is another Mosquito man who's working with one of my maps to teach some people how they're going to work to draw maps. The Mosquito have cattle, but they keep them in the village because they don't want them out in the forest where animals can kill them, and they don't want to make holes in the forest. I wrote an article about this for Conservation Biology a few years ago because you got a lot of cow poop in the village that makes it a little tricky to walk, but that keeps the cows around where you need them. This is a Mayagna village along the Rio Banqui in Nicaragua, across the river from Honduras, where I'm taking that picture from. And the Mayagna don't raise cattle. The Mayama, they just don't want the cattle in the village, and they don't want them in the forest, so they don't raise cattle and they don't eat beef. The Cocamilla people that I lived with, these are Mayagna women and their kids.
What-
Yeah.
I was wondering, if blood,
If they use the blood? Yes. Yes. Yeah, nothing is wasted. These are Mayagna women. And these are Mayagna men that I worked with when I was mapping their territory. I spent 6 years in Guatemala on and off mapping all of the territorial land claims of indigenous people there. And this was my crew for Mayagna Sauni As, the first Mayagna territory. These are Yanesha women. I lived with the Yanesha for, 2.5 years, nearly 3 years. Brought my daughter to, this is in the highlands, in the high jungles of Peru that these guys live. And they're dancing. This is a celebration they're having. And here are some Yanesha men who are painting up. Now, a number of Indian groups, women don't paint, but the men do. And has always made me wonder at what point in our history it became the women that had to paint up and the men not. Probably when they had jobs. These guys spend quite a bit of time painting, and they had cattle that was forced on them by German colonists who, under the current laws of Peru, were not allowed to have a cattle ranch more than 300 hectares. And so they inflicted cattle on these people, and a system called almedias, which means that they would cut the forest for the cows, and they'd feed the cows, and they would get half of the calves that were born to them. And so when the Germans got forced out while I was there by the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path guerrilla, the Yanesha let all the cattle go, and the Germans took them with them, and these guys sold the cattle that they had, and they let the whole forest grow up. So when I went back in the year 2000, the forest, they had a lot more forest than they had. That's what they wanted, not cattle. This is the Cocamilla guy fishing. This is, I thought you might want to see these. Cocamilla are fish herders, but they have a number of ways of catching them. This is one called the tarafa. And these are some of the fish that are caught with the tarafa. And these are Cocamilla people preparing land to be farmed. And they farm in, they have two kinds of farms. One's in the high ground and one's in the low. This one's in kind of intermediate, and it gets wet when the water goes up. But their plots are fairly small, and they don't tend to hunt inland from their plots in the high forest. And of course, they have to plant with a digging stick.
What does it like?
Well, these guys are planting rice, but they raise manioc, they raise plantains, they raise bananas, they raise jute. Okay.
Do they use plants?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. This is manioc. And it is used for everything. It's made into a powder like that people carry in their handbags when they're hiking. And it's dry. And they make it into those mayos that you saw, those big tortilla looking things. And they make, I'm not showing pictures of, I have a bunch of pictures of them making the manioc powder or manioc grill, and it's quite an interesting process. They have to cut it all to pieces and then let it rot or let it begin to develop. I guess beginning to spoil, and then they put it in a big thing called a TPT and squeeze it so that all the poison in the manioc runs out, and then they eat it. This is the guy making this is Mr. Kuritima, who's working in the high forest, and you can see it takes quite a lot of strength and courage to be farming out there. And this is people who are farming rice on the river when it's at low river, and they will harvest it before the river goes up. So they don't involve any forest in this at all. And this is some hunting going on. This is hunting for one of the small critters related to the guinea pig. This is a deer that was hunted. 95% of the hunting goes on around the gardens. They don't go plunging into the deep forest to hunt animals. They try to protect their crops. So the animals that get in there are fair game. These are other relatives of the guinea pig of the Andes. This one is the Cuniculus paca, which is called a majas in the Cocamilla language. And they weigh about 30 pounds and they are delicious. This is Mayagna Sauni As. That was the territory I was mapping with the Mayagna. And I'm going to note a few things for you. See, there are two protected areas. The dark green are protected areas. The gold is, this is where gold is mined by them. And the gold can be mined by anyone. You can come into their territory to do that. This is where they farm along the river. This is where the hunting basically stops. Occasionally it goes on in this area. And as I was mapping them, I noticed that there were a lot of mountains with the same name, and they were all right around in here and out in here. And they were called Asang Manuhane. And I finally said, is this some kind of mistake? You know, why would we have all the mountains with the same name? And it turned out there's this monster with red eyes, one big red eye and big claws. And if you kill an animal anywhere around that mountain, you'll be killed. And so that protects that whole strain here. The interesting thing is when I got done with a few years, this is the one you just looked at. And this was the second territory I mapped with the Mayagna. And they had, I don't think they had cooperated with these people about the protected areas, but this whole part of the Isabela mountain range is protected. No one can hunt there. And it's all the same kind of story. It's just a protected area. These are Kokamilia guys fishing with nets. And one of the things that happens with nets is that there are two species of dolphins that lived in that lake where they live. And one of them is the pink dolphin, and they don't have any case for it. But the blue dolphin, occasionally, when that net starts to close up, it'll frequently be attacked by dolphins. And they will eat, you know, they'll just release all the fish in the thing and eat them. And you would think that these guys would kill dolphins, but they don't. Well, I think it's because they believe the dolphins turn into humans and they come to dances, and occasionally they have a lot of stories about dolphins coming to dances, and occasionally if a child is born misformed or misshapen, it's believed that she made love to a dolphin after the dance, and the dolphins sometimes will leave a hat on the beach as they go back into the water. And it turns out that these guys don't eat any of the predators. They don't kill any of the predators. They don't kill dolphins. They don't kill manatees. They don't kill boa constrictors. They don't kill anacondas. They don't kill the alligators, the caiman. And as we know from our experience in the United States with ecology, if you kill the predators, the lower levels of population get completely out of control. That has happened in the East when we killed all the Indians, and the white-tailed deer are now a huge problem for everyone on the East Coast that lives around a forest. And if you go into Yellowstone, you'll find that if the deer aren't hunted, they eat a lot of the bark too, right? They'll eat everything they can. So, and a boa constrictor, if they are out hunting around their village and they run into a boa constrictor, they have to go home and go on a diet and pray for a day or two. It is considered very, so if you don't kill the predators, that means you can always get the rest of the animals. It means that you've maintained the ecology of the forest that you're living around, right? These guys have caught this Kokamilia fishing, and they have caught a fish that's scientific name is Arapaima gigas, and they are a air-breathing codfish that lives in the lake, and they have to come up to breathe. But these guys have a lake, two or three lakes close to them that are protected by monsters, and those are the ones that the young paiches live in. And they're all just full of paiches, and they're full of moss and stuff because the paiches they need air to breathe. And you would think that they would hunt them, but they don't. And they say if you fish in one of those lakes and you get a paiche, a monster will rise out of the water and kill you. And eat your canoe too, you lose the whole thing. So when the paiche are big, they grow to about this size within 6 years. And when they're big, they leave those lakes and come out into the lake. And these guys hunt them with detachable headed harpoons, just like the Eskimos. No, no, the monsters they're protecting the crop of paiche. But the paiches are fair game. And during the steamboat era, there are very few paiches left in the Amazon. During the steamboat era, they caught them and used them for food for the passengers on the steamboats. And that's happened to a lot of people. Protected areas are interesting. I've worked quite a lot in Ecuador with the Waorani people, who are one of the wildest people around. They have two of their clans are still out of contact. The Taromenane and the Tagaere came to meet the missionary Rachel Saint when she pacified them, and they didn't want anything to do with us, and so they live out in the jungle on their own. And the WOWs have how can I say it? The WOWs own land that has been granted to them that's about 2.5 million acres of land, and they do not have a management plan for them. And I was never able to figure that out until I started mapping them. And I was invited by one of the communities to go make a map of their claim. And the WOWs, most of their 45% of their deaths of males are done by other WOWs with spears. They're all fight with each other, and their communities are widely separated from each other. And the village I went in, I found out that they, when we got done mapping it, they have a big protected area that's just that village. It's twice as much land as the village occupies in any other category, and they can't hunt in there. And then I've done 4 other wild communities since then, and they all have their own protected areas. And since no one has ever mapped in there that stuff, they can't have a management plan because nobody knew anything about all those protected areas. And I'm not quite done with that. They would like me to come back, but I don't have a grant for it right now. And if next time I see them, I will tell them what they're going to need to do if they want to finish the mapping and the territorial claims. Yeah, the thing with indigenous people, that's true of the Miskito, and it's true of the Mayanga, and it's true of every other group that I've lived with, that they kill for need. They don't kill for markets. And that's true of the Kokamilla. It's true of well, the Kokamilla have every animal in the forest has a spirit for the species of animal that it is. And those spirits, if you want to kill something, you have to pray, and you can only kill as much as you need. You can only kill one of them. And if you kill more, bad things can happen. Mosquito people, I know one mosquito guy who got, and they died for fish in the Wonky River, and he got a hold of flippers and a spear gun and some glasses, and started taking a bunch of fish out, and he was selling them in a market, and they killed him. And the Waorani people also will kill people who take beef, take animals, and they use them in the market. They don't want to be related to a market. And you can imagine that if you are related to a market, you can take out anything you need, right? I mean, you can take out because it becomes money. It's not about life or ecology or anything. It's like it's where it can make some money.
so isolated that they just never.
Well, a number of them are isolated. Brazilian Indians have quite large territories that are now being invaded and by people who want cows, and they're burning them. But you know, the big fires in the Amazon are all from cattle and soybeans. They want to.
Flashing here where murder is accepted by the indigenous people within their community, but in the wider sense, it's a crime.
Yeah, I was training forest guards of the Waorani a few years ago, and one of our forest guards went into a local mestizo town and got drunk, and he was with his brother. He was with his cousin, and they argued over a woman, and so he killed his cousin, which the Waorani are quite used to doing. I mean, they're quite okay with murder, and he fled into the Mayangna territory or into the Waorani territory where the cops wouldn't go in there because they would be killed if they went in. And he came back to us, and my colleagues I was working with Wildlife Conservation Society, the WCS out of the Bronx Zoo, and they said, well, we can't work with Herman because the cops want him. He murdered his cousin. And I said, well, how did the Waorani feel about it? And his prestige went up because with modern times, those kids aren't murdering people. And the fact that this guy had taken a life was like he was somebody. And so I said, well, if his colleagues don't mind and the cops aren't coming after him, then. And the cops said they'd given up on it. They weren't going to work in Waorani territory. These are Kokamiya women who get their water from the lake. I don't know how much this has to do with ecology, but I told you once that these people are fish herders. And these women go to get their water down there. They bathe their animal guts, every fish guts, animal guts that come into the village are all taken down and thrown in the river. If you want to poop and you've got a canoe, you go out in the lake and poop there. If you don't have a canoe, you go to a place, a creek that's in their language actually called Shit Creek. And that's where you would poop. And it would go into the lake. And over a period of time, I measured in various parts of the lake how much time was being spent for what yield. I was interested in optimal foraging at the time. So I had a time spent plus yield for several places in the lake. When the water goes up every year, those fish go into the forest. The big fish all go into the forest because the hunting's better and fishing, you can't really fish in the forest. And you might guess where most of the fish were hanging out, right in front of the village. They didn't go into the forest because they were being fed. They were being managed. They were being herded. These guys are fish herders. And what that means in terms of fishing is that with all our ways of protecting the fish, the paiche and these fish out here, they don't make it easy for people to come in with big nets, with big boats and nets for them because there's nothing for them there. Took me a while to learn this. I had been collecting data, I think, and recording it for about a year before I finally realized that the most efficient place to fish when all the other fish went in the forest was right there, right in front of the community. So that concludes this talk. Yes.
Tell us how to shoot the head. I'm not gonna do it. You aren't serious?
That what?
You invited that question by saying they taught me how to shrink heads. Can you talk about that?
They probably had a different what?
How do they shrink heads? That tribe that you.
Oh,
Heads.
well, you
Go on. But I'm
well,
curious.
They usually, the people they kill are usually considered to have killed their children. Because they live in various villages. And that would be a shaman who lives in another village who's managed to kill your kid. And so when they lose a couple of kids, or maybe two or three, they will go in the morning, they will show up at that person's place. And when they come down to bathe in the morning, they will kill them and cut their head off and bring the head back. And then they begin to cut in the back of the neck over to the top of the head, and they peel the face off. And then then they fill it with hot sand, and they sew it temporarily back together, and they leave it to begin to shrink. And over a period of about 3 weeks, the head will gradually shrink up, and then they can wear it on their belt. And if you have a head on your belt, you're somebody for the Kandoshi.
Salt, bones, they don't use those.
They don't use the bones.
The hot sand, and what is it filled with after the hot sand is?
It's repeatedly hot sand. You take sand out and put more sand in through the neck.
Is there anything in it?
What's in it?
Well, the head's small enough that there's nothing inside it.
I see the betting face. Yeah, I'm gonna.
Well, I used to be a mining engineer for a few years, and we use ammonium nitrate for explosives, and they drill holes in the side of the mine and then fill it with ammonium nitrate and then put a blasting cap in there, and then everybody backs off and they blow it up. But I knew how to make a pipe bomb. And I used to teach my students how to do that. And then I began to think maybe one of them would do it.
I have,
Yes.
considering how they utilized, the water resource as a toilet, how did they, what was their way of cleaning their water or their clean water source?
When they bring the pitchers in, they don't boil it, they just drink it.
Nobody got FA.
I don't think it was a major thing for them. A lot of that stuff, well, it's the fish eat all that, right? I mean, it's not like hanging out in the water. And just offshore of the community, right in front of the community, I used to go fishing there. I had a fishing rod for a while, and I would always catch piranha. I mean, that was the first thing to throw your, in fact, the last 3 feet of the fishing line had to be wire because the piranha would immediately attack anything in the.
Yeah, that's why I'm kind of surprised nobody was getting FA.
Yeah, well, it didn't, I was not aware of any major health issues with that.
But you were there a long time. I know you would know.
Yeah, I was there for what? No, we boiled water at my house.
Okay. All right.
You might not have had the natural immunity that they had, or whatever was floating around.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have another question about health, but it's mental health. What about the children whose parents were murdered when they were about 7? I mean, that seems like incredible.
You know, that was one of their ways of, like I say, achieving genetic diversity. And that was, well, the kids would come back and they'd be raised as Cocamilla. And they're not getting home. They're not going home. Their folks are dead. You know, they are being raised by people who value them, and they become Cocamilla. The Cocamilla have a lot of different phenotypes, and I think that's probably still within their genetic thing that they have from a number of different tribes around them.
Was that fairly recently that you lived among them?
That what?
Was it recently that you lived among those people?
Not real recently. I visited them 2 years ago, I have a compadre that I asked, he's the godfather of my daughter. And I went down to find him for one thing out in the jungle. I put out a radio notice that said that Anthony's in town and could you come in to find me? And he did, and I set up a system for him so I can share my pension from the university with one Guatemalan guy and my compadre.
But they still,
Because he's the same age I am. He's 84 years old. And it's hard for him to do the kind of work he needs to do to live like that.
as far as you know, they still practice that form of birth control, well, population control.
No, they raise their own children now. It's considered tacky to go kill people.
They'll keep the firstborn daughter.
Yeah, I mean, for the Coconilla, they have, I think I counted about a 25% death rate for their children from various diseases, but that means 75% of them grow up. And they value those kids. I mean, they're really nice to their kids. And they were really nice to my kid. That kid, her feet never hit the ground for the first year of her life. She was raised, a Coconilla woman they had helped me build a house in the place that they wanted a cement floor because they wanted to be able to dance on it when I left. And so they, yeah, where were we? Oh, yeah. No, people would come into the house and I had hired a girl to keep eyes on her because we were working out in the field a lot. And some woman would come, or a different woman every day, and they just grabbed the baby and they were gone. And the baby would be passed around, but she was never allowed to be on the floor, crawling around in the dirt. And then they'd bring her back about 4 or 5 in the afternoon with purple stuff on her face and from whatever they were feeding her. They helped house train her too. I didn't realize, I wasn't sure how she was going to be house trained, but she would go out in the chicken yard and walk around when she was bigger. And she would come back and bang on the back door of the house. And I'd go over and say, "What's going on, honey?" And she'd say, "Papi, trae hojas, bring leaves." She needed to wipe herself. And she was, housebroken. She needed leaves. Well, it has become a lot easier with GPS. And what I do is I'll go into a village by invitation. I have to be asked to be there. And then I ask them to name a number of people I can train, and I will train them in GPS. And then I can send them around to where they consider the boundaries of their property, which are quite big. I mean, some of them are on tops of mountains, and they will, they'll do that. They'll hike out through the forest and climb mountains and tell me what the boundaries of their territory are. And we have not had any cases where neighboring communities, where neighboring people, Mayagnasaunias, the one I showed you there, has 12 villages in it. And Nicaragua didn't have a way to title a territory. They had old things that they sometimes would title a community, but they didn't have any territorial titling. But I didn't invent it, I just discovered it, and that's what they wanted. But the neighboring community, after they found out what we were doing in this one, the neighboring territory asked me to come work with them on the Bokai River, and they spoke a somewhat different dialect from the one in Mayagnasaunias. But once those folks are trained, then I leave paper out and I start drawing maps, right? And I make sure that that we get every mountain and every stream in that territory is named, so we don't leave anything to chance. And I'm told that the next time Nicaragua does their national map, that they're going to include. I think we have identified somewhere over 5,000 to 6,000 names of places and streams that weren't on their maps. They had no idea. When I went out there at first, it took me a year in Managua before I was invited by them to go work in Mayagna-Sound-Eos. There were a bunch of gangsters from that tribal group that had moved to Managua after the Sandinista Revolution. They had wanted to work with Indian groups, and these guys had moved into Managua, and their business was, anytime a foreign donor came into Managua that wanted to work with Indians, they would say, well, you have to give money to us. We'll let you do that. We'll take that money out and spend it. But they ended up building themselves houses and things like that. So I made a friend who was a Mayagna guy who had come into town, and I was introduced to him, and he went out and he said, send some money out to these Mayagna-Sound-Eos people, and you can use these crooks. We knew they were crooks by then. And he said, don't give them much money. And they came back and said that they had done what I asked them to do. And then I was invited by him to go out and tell them that, and find out that they hadn't done anything. They had just stolen the money. So they invited me to stay. And I bought a Russian Jeep for $500, a WAS, they call it. And took my son with me that year. He was about 9, I guess, and took him. We loaded him up in the Jeep and drove all the way out to the East Coast and went up the rivers to the Mayagna communities. And there we stayed for the next 6 months. It took us 6 months to get the first maps built, but by then I had a methodology that pretty much worked, and I could get them to also make sure we knew all the names of everything around it. I got them on the map. I should have brought one. I have a big map at home of Mayagna-Sound-Eos that I could have showed you, but it's big map.
How did the Nicaraguan government respect the?
Well, I'll tell you, first thing is they didn't know how many people or even what tribes lived out there. And most of those people had been taken out during the war, during the Contra War. And it wasn't until 1991 that they would let any of those people go back into their territories. And then they found that the government had made the whole thing a protected area called the Boso Was. It's now a United Nations territorial claim. But the Indians who got back out, the Miskito and the Mayagna who got back into the areas that they had lived, found that they were living in a protected area, and they didn't even know if they were going to be allowed to hunt or fish or farm. And they were really ticked off. And the government sent some people out, one guy out to talk to them about it. And they had to relent pretty much the idea that these guys couldn't farm or couldn't hunt. And for several years, these Miskito that I was first talking to out there, our government had planted mines all over their forests, and so kids would go out and play with the mines and blow their hands off. And yeah, it was a shame. I mean, we really supported a rotten government. And when the Sandinistas came in, they were at first viewed as liberators, right? And everybody in Western Nicaragua really appreciated those guys and they could walk individually. You know, you'd see a woman soldier with a rifle out in one of these towns, and she'd be walking by herself. But out in the Indian area, out in the East Coast of Nicaragua, that wasn't happening at all. The Miskito didn't want the Sandinistas at all about anything, and several of them had joined the Contra groups, and government out there, the soldiers walked around about in half a dozen with rifles and things, and made the indigenous people pretty uncomfortable. Now Ortega turns out to be a dictator, so.
How does the Peruvian government deal with the indigenous people?
Well, Not very well. The native community system was never big enough. The communities that they titled to Indians had space in between them that mestizos moved into, and they began to farm on an Indian property. And we have since spent several years. I was done with this 5 or 6 years ago, but I've spent several years with ecologists trying to create indigenous uh, indigenous use zones where they could hunt and fish that weren't within their relatively small communities, and those have sort of worked out. But there are still, Peru has 25 different languages out there, and there are very few mestizo people who speak any of those languages. So it's pretty hard for them to communicate with the Indians. And as I say, there are 2 of those groups in Ecuador that are still out of contact. It's funny because when I mapped one of the Ecuadorian communities, there's a park called the Yasuni National Park out on their border with Peru. And the Yasuni has 2 Waorani villages within it. And I asked them, when I was mapping out there, I asked them if they ever saw Waorani, and they said, well, if you're walking a trail inland into the forest and you run into a pair of kids' shorts or a shirt hanging in a tree on an arrow, that's Waorani. That's Tagaere or their Taromenane. And they don't actually know what the boundaries. They were given a legal boundary. Ecuador was suffered a lawsuit over it, and they decided to create an area for these people that were out of contact. And of course, they didn't know what the territorial boundaries were because, they're out of contact. And you're not allowed to talk to any of those people. I mean, loggers will sometimes go in and kill a village of people and take their wood, but theoretically, you're not supposed to interact with them at all. But while I was working in Ecuador on those villages, there were some other indigenous people, the Quechua, who were living along the Napo River, and they were farming in what they thought was an area that they could build a farm. And the Taromenane or the Tagaere, I don't know which ones they were, but they went in and killed them. They thought they shouldn't be there, and that was their territory, and that wasn't anywhere near. And the thing I finally concluded was that if you're out in the boonies, anywhere in that 2.5 million acre property, and you're not in the company of Waorani village, that you better watch your butt because something could happen.
When we were in Costa Rica, we were right on the border of Nicaragua. And they told us that children in the villages can come into Costa Rica to go to school for free.
Mhm.
What about the rest of the country?
Yeah, which indigenous people were they?
I don't know. It said
Well-
indigenous people along the coast border
Well,
were able to cross the border.
yeah, there was a group called the Maleku Indians that lived out there, and during the war, the U.S. said a lot of lies. I mean, one thing is they said that they didn't have any airports that the Contras were able to use against the Nicaraguans, and they wanted these Maleku moved off the border, and they lived in the swamps out there on the border, and they moved them like 50 miles inland where they could keep them from collaborating with the Nicaraguans. And the Dutch got interested in them. And I got onto them because I was working at that point for cultural survival. And there was an issue in the newspaper about these Indians up north that had invaded a hacienda property. And so I drove up there to see what was going on, and the Dutch had built them. I think they wanted them to look like teepees, but they had built them cement houses with conical roofs. And the Maleku wouldn't live in them. They just hated it. And I wouldn't either if I were a Maleku. And they had given them a radio station that was supposed to be able to play Maleku music. And they had gotten a guy that spoke Maleku to manage that radio station. And what they didn't know, and what I discovered, was that the Maleku were, I don't know how many groups in the world are like this, but they had made a decision probably 1,000 years ago or more that the distribution of knowledge would be distributed by clan. And if you were not the clan that was the music clan, you couldn't play Maleku music. And they didn't have anybody in that clan around there. And so the radio station just played popular Costa Rican music. That was the only thing they could play. Because, you know, if you were, yeah, it's like dividing up your people as a library, you know, with this part of the books or your clan and these parts. And if you needed it to cooperate between clans for information, you would have to get people together who could do that. But you were not supposed to take knowledge that belonged to other people.
My question was there any education for all these children, or did they just learn survival skills?
Well, they had a school. Yeah, they had, the thing is that the government, these guys, when I was there just were some people who were coming back from their home territory. They'd gone down there illegally to get turtles. And they brought these turtles back to the village, and they didn't have any place to farm. And they were on the grounds of a hacienda, and the hacienda owner had left. And so they invaded the hacienda and they were farming there. And I think the government let them alone in that. I mean, they didn't have anywhere else to go. They couldn't, or some of them may have now gone back to their territory. I haven't visited them for a long time. But I wrote an article for the Pocatello newspaper for it. I was so charmed by the idea that your library was all your clans, right?
So most of the languages, or some of them, have been transcribed and translated.
Well, the Cocomedia language was translated by a woman named Norma Faust, who worked for the Bible. They call it's the Wycliffe Bible translators, and they have missionaries that go out and Norma had worked on them, and it was she who told me that I should go look for the Cocomedia because she said that it would do them some good to have somebody, a gringo living out there to protect them from some kinds of things. And actually, I think a lot of mestizo people who were going to rob them or do things to them didn't do that while I was there. They realized there was a gringo there that might make trouble.
Put on our westernized glasses and look at it and not understand that that culture is different. So maybe they are being taught, but they're being taught by the patriarch of the tribe or whatever, like they're being taught what they need.
Yeah. Well, the Yanesha people that I lived with, I was an advisor to the Peruvian government. I was hired by USAID to go down and work on this conservation and development program. It was the world's first. And there were 10 Yanesha communities that we titled before I started getting serious about being there. And they all had schools with mestizo school teachers. They probably would have liked to have their own, but they didn't have the education for people to do it. So. I left them in 86. So I went out in 84, 83. Yeah, most of them do. Not the wows. The wows, you'll still see wows that, in fact, they had they had a ceremony, USAID had a separate program in Ecuador for the Waorani, and they brought some of them into town, and, you know, women didn't have any tops on, and a couple of the guys didn't have any shorts on, and they were perfectly comfortable with that, but everyone around them was like, oh, don't look at this. Hmm? Well, I took Gabi down when she was 4 months old, and then Nicholas, when he was 8. He came down to Costa Rica when I worked for Cultural Survival. They published a good magazine, but they were really terrible at field work. They just did not get it, and I was their only field worker, and so all the issues that came up in Central America, I had to deal with.
Your children, they were there, like your daughter was there, the baby, and then she came back.
She came back, and her first language was Cocamilla. And then we didn't speak English at home because we didn't want to have people feel that we were not speaking a language that they understood. And the Cocamilla spoke Spanish as well as their own language. And when mestizos would come around, they'd try to pretend that they didn't speak their own language. And they had a marriage system that you would marry your mother's brother's daughter if you were a man, or your father's sister's son if you were a guy. And when the priest would come out, it was a Catholic priest would be out there once a year to do marriages, and they would just lie to him. They'd say, no, they're not even related. But they didn't alter their marriage system one bit for anybody else. And so they were, I guess, the book I wrote about them is called The Invisible Indian, and because they were invisible to the mestizos around them, but in their own village, they were definitely Cocamilla. And every time they would tell a joke or anything, they always did it in their own language. But my daughter, when she got back, she was in the 4th grade after I finished in Peru, and the other kids in the 4th grade were asking her about her life, and she started to tell them, and then they called her Jungle Girl. And then she just denied that she spoke Spanish for years. She would not tell them anything about her life and denied that she spoke Spanish. And it wasn't until the kid got into high school and there was a Spanish club that she started to speak it again. And of course, she's flawless in her Spanish. She doesn't have any accent at all. Gabi is, that's her native language. And so she, ISU used to bring her over to our Spanish program when they had their final exams or the midterm exams in the language department, and they would give the exams for her to read and tell them where the mistakes were before they had the students. Dan Hunt said they really missed her when she went to college.
That accident that was just a few months ago, a plane crashed in the jungle. Actually, I think it was Brazil, and the only survivors were children.
It's the Indian kids. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they survived.
They survived for 40 days. And actually, they hid out from the people that were hunting for them at one time because some of those guys were carrying guns and they thought they were after them. So they hid.
But the skills that those young children had.
Yeah, they knew what to eat. I've noticed that among a number of different people that get out in the jungle with them and they pick this up and that up and, and give it to you to eat. And you would never think of it for yourself.
So, you have spent so much time living in culture that really have different life philosophy versus what we call a Western society.
Mm-hmm.
What if any still think that, or you wish we all did that they did, or, and what would you say to us from that?
What would I say about it?
You know, like what sticks to you most that trying to end
You're talking about my life.
how they live
Oh, I was pretty uncomfortable when I came back.
What can we learn from the indigenous people?
What made you?
Where do you begin?
Well, I've never worked with the indigenous people in the United States, except that well, for ISU, I founded the Indian Studies program. And we had a Shoshone woman who taught our kids to speak. And turned out most of the students in her classes were Shoshone because the Shoshone weren't teaching their own kids to speak their language. Many of them were ashamed of it. And they didn't want to share it. They didn't want to share the language of their children. So they had to go to college to study the language.
More like a philosophy or something. As Western people.
What can we learn?
Yeah.
Well, I'd learned, for one thing, to respect their land rights. I would learn, for another thing, to, I guess, some of the things I've learned is that that you need to be very careful about what you say to people, and particularly if you're dealing with money issues and you're worried about rent and things like that, that a lot of indigenous people just don't want to deal with that. And in the United States and in South and Central America, I guess I learned what to eat. I learned what not to say. I learned how to be with a bunch of people without speaking much, and which I'm violating right now. Oh yeah. No, when I started to do this program, I've written a lot. If you wanted to look up stuff that I have written, you would go to Google Scholar and write Anthony Stocks, and you'll find page after page of stuff that I've written. And some of that stuff is available. You can just download it right off Google. And academia, also the website for academia has some of my work. And as I was doing this presentation, I realized that I'd written all these things about these people, and I knew about the monsters that protect the animals in this culture or that culture or the other, but I never tried to put it together in terms of their management of the ecology, how they relate to the canopy, how they relate to all these people that live under the canopy. And so putting a talk together was actually pretty good for me. It's taken like a month or two to get it together, decide what I want to say. About population control, about how they manage the forest. Some indigenous groups in Brazil plant trees as they move to different villages. And the Kandashi people that I showed you the picture of, they move their village every 7 years. They do their agriculture right on the shore of the Nukurai River, and every 7 years they move the village and they leave all those animals alone. Any hunting they do, and they don't come back for like another 20 years or 25 years. As I was going in with them, they brought well, we couldn't get my boat into the community because the water had gone down in the Nukurai River and the boat wouldn't get past the logs. And so the Kandashi heard that I was coming from somebody in the church, I guess, had notified one of them that I was coming. They came down to get me. And as we went up, it took a week to get up to the top of the river in a canoe. And so we camped out every night, and practically every night it was in a village that had been abandoned 20 or 30 years ago. And there were like lime trees that were still growing, and limes and things yeah, but they wouldn't stick around they wouldn't stay in one place longer than 7 years. And that was how they managed their forest, right? They let everything grow back up.
I'm gonna ask one more question.
Okay.
Well, my question is anybody who's not been back, you're not doing mapping any longer, is that correct? For these tribes, for any tribe? You're not doing any mapping, is that correct?
Well, I was mapping up until last summer.
I'm just wondering who you passed the baton, to, right? Doing that now.
Nobody. Yeah. Well, there are groups in Nicaragua, the World Bank decided they wanted a biological corridor in Nicaragua, so they wanted the rest of the territory. And the Miskito people had territories too, it turned out, denied by Charles, a guy who wrote the book on them, said that they weren't not territorial, but they were. And those folks, because of the need for the biological territory, they decided to pass a law 445 in Nicaragua, that allowed the territorial titling to take place. But the people who have done it don't know what they're doing. One thing they are is a couple of universities have attempted it. There have been 9 territories that were titled and mapped in Nicaragua, and I've done 8 of them. And I finished doing that years ago. But these people would send out a team of people, and then a week or 2 later, they would have done what they were supposed to do, and another team would come in. But the Indians I know, they want to know you. I don't go in and out. I go in and live with them. I eat what they eat, and I do what, I take part in their lives. And so they learn to trust me. They learn to deal with me. But what they'll do to these other people is they work with them for a month or 2, and then they say, "Get out of here. We don't want to have. We'd rather not have a territory than have you dealing with it."
Well, thank you so much. I sure knew it. You're going to say.